today we're going to talk about politics in the Gilded Age. We're looking specifically at 1877 to 1900. I'm a hot mess today. All right, politics of the Gilded Age. The expression Gilded Age was first used by Mark Twain in 1873 as the title of a book, and it referred to the superficial glitter of the new wealth that was so prominently displayed in the late 19th century. If you remember, we talked about the nouveau riche. This is the nouveau riche. This is kind of goes along with that. Historians argue that this time period's politics were more show than substance. This was the time period of forgettable presidents, essentially, none of which served more than 2 consecutive terms. Politicians pretty much ignore the problems that came from the growth of industry in the cities. So the urbanization, the rapid urbanization that causes all sorts of crowding and slum-like conditions and so on and so forth. These kind of get swept under the rug so that we can continue making more money and so on and so forth. Both major political parties avoid taking a stand on controversial issues. So this is a time period when not a whole lot gets done, but a whole lot of stuff needs to get done. Causes of these stalemates, why something doesn't happen. 1, prevailing political ideology at the time, campaign tactics of both of the parties involved, and party patronage. The prevailing political ideology of the time essentially was a belief in limited government. If you remember the concept of laissez-faire, where the government would have a hands-off kind of theme when approaching big business, railroads, so on and so forth. Do little government was in turn with the 2 other popular ideas at the time, like I just said, laissez-faire economics, and of course social Darwinism, the concept that the strongest will survive. And those that are not strong will just kind of fade away. Campaign tactics of the 2 parties. Campaign strategy. The elections at this time were so close. Some presidents were winning only by electoral votes, no popular votes. Since they were so evenly matched, the objective was to get out the vote and not alienate voters on the issue. Republicans in the North kept the memory of the Civil War alive by waving what they called the bloody shirt, and we covered that with your vocab, so you should know what I'm talking about when I say that. They wanted to keep the votes of the reformers and the African Americans. Strength for the Republicans came from businessmen, middle-class men, Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and supporters of temperance and prohibition. They also followed the tradition of the Whigs, which essentially meant that they were pro-business. On the other side of the aisle, the Confederates, the Democrats, they could count on winning every election in the former states of the Confederacy. In the North, strength came from big city political machines and, of course, the immigrant vote. They also received votes from Catholics, Lutherans, and Jews. They objected temperance and prohibition. Again, temperance and prohibition, outlawing the sale of alcohol, etc., and argued that state rights and limiting powers, argued for states' rights and limited powers for the federal government. Lastly, party patronage. Politics in this area were chiefly a game of winning elections, holding office, and providing government jobs to the party faithful. Stalwarts, half-breeds, and mugwumps are all terms from this time period as well. Historians consider this era a low point in American politics. Gilded Age presidents reflected the stalemate: Rutherford B. Hayes, James Garfield, and Chester A. Arthur. Grover Cleveland, who we talked about in class today, was honest, frugal, conscientious, and uncompromising. He was the mayor of Buffalo an incorruptible governor of New York State. He was also a Democrat. Cleveland reformed the civil service system by approving the Pendleton Act, which set up the Civil Service Commission. Money question, like we talked about today, this was an overriding question of all politics type stuff during this time period. A big question of this time period was how much to expand the money supply. For the economy to grow soundly, it needed more money in circulation. Debtors, farmers, and startup businesses wanted soft money in circulation. Having soft money would enable them to, one, borrow money at lower interest rates, and two, pay off their loans more easily with inflated dollars. They campaigned for more paper money and then for unlimited minting of silver coins. Bankers, creditors, investors, established businesses obviously wanted the opposite. They wanted sound or hard money, which was currency backed by gold and stored in government vaults. Dollars backed by gold would hold their value against inflation. So let's talk a little bit about the Greenback Party. The Greenback Party, the U.S. issued money that was not backed by gold or silver in the late 1860s during the Civil War. This was an emergency measure to help finance the war. As a result, farmers receiving high prices during the war prospered from the use of greenbacks, but eventually they were withdrawn from circulation. So supporters of paper money eventually ended up forming their own party, and that party was known as the Greenbacks. In the election of 1878, the Greenback candidate actually received nearly 1 million votes. 14 members were elected to Congress, and the idea of silver money didn't seem so terrible after all. Now, we see during this specific time period of 1888 to 1896 the growth of discontent. By the late 1800s, the people of America were annoyed at the political stalemate that was happening. There was discontent over growing government corruption, money issues, tariffs, railroads, and of course trusts. Politicians started taking small steps to help, but it would take a third party and, in fact, a major depression to really shake things up. Benjamin Harrison was a dude, a guy, and he was a Republican, wasn't he? Republicans controlled both houses and the presidency, passed the first billion-dollar budget in U.S. history. He issued the McKinley Tariff, which raised the tax on foreign products. He increased the monthly pensions of Civil War veterans, widows, and kids. He enforced the Sherman Antitrust Act. He increased the coinage of silver with the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And he also proposed a bill to protect the voting rights of African Americans. Then we see the populists. The populists wanted direct popular election of senators. They wanted the use of initiatives and referendums that would allow for citizens to vote directly on proposed laws. They wanted unlimited coinage of silver. They also wanted a graduated income tax, public ownership of railroads by the U.S. government, telegraph and telephone systems to be owned and operated by the U.S. government. They also wanted loans in federal warehouses for farmers to enable them to stabilize prices, and they also wanted an 8-hour workday for industrial workers. We see the Panic of 1893 kind of seep in and really cause a lot of issues in the U.S. Grover Cleveland finds himself back in the White House. The stock market crashes for several reasons, but one of them is over-speculation. This downtime, this crash actually and depression or panic lasts about 4 years. During this time period, farm foreclosures reach record highs. Unemployment is about 20%, which is right in line with the Great Depression. People start relying on soup kitchens to feed themselves and their families, and they also start riding the rails because they're looking for something to do and maybe somewhere to go where they can actually get a job. The gold reserve had fallen dangerously low, which makes a lot of people very uncomfortable and uneasy. Cleveland at this time turns to J.P. Morgan, who you'll remember was one of our big time head honcho billionaires from early on in this time period. And he asked for $65 million in gold to support the dollar and the gold standard. This annoyed some people, obviously, because it looked like the government was only a tool for rich bankers. But in the end, J.P. Morgan and his buddies really helped to bail out the United States. As the Depression worsened, people took it into their own hands. Like we talked about Coxey's Army. Essentially, this was a march on Washington in 1894 led by Jacob A. Coxey, who was from Ohio. Him and thousands of unemployed people marched on Washington demanding that the federal government spend $500 million on a public works program, which would help stimulate and create jobs. This is, a project that comes in later to play when we talk about what FDR does to get our country out of the Depression many years later. Unfortunately for Coxey and his army, however, they're arrested for trespassing. So a turning point in American politics happens in 1869. The way that Grover Cleveland handled the Depression totally discredited the conservative leadership of the Democratic Party, and Democrats were killed in the congressional elections of 1894 by Republicans. Therefore, populists continued to gain votes and seats at this time. The election of 1896 is viewed as one of the most emotional elections in U.S. history. In fact, it would mark the beginning of a new era of American politics. Democrats were divided between gold Democrats who were loyal to Cleveland and pro-silver Democrats who were looking for a leader. That leader essentially ends up being William Jennings Bryan, and he comes up with this amazing speech called the Cross of Gold speech, which is something that we will listen to in class. Democratic platform during this time, essentially they favored unlimited coinage of silver and the tradition, but inflationary, meaning that, they didn't, the ratio of 16 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. They went on a free silver campaign. The Republican candidate was William McKinley, and he was from Ohio. He was considered a friend of labor and also supported a high protective tariff. He promised a strong, prosperous industrial nation. His platform essentially would be that the high tariff would protect industry and uphold the gold standard against unlimited coinage of silver. William Jennings Bryan made the Democratic Populist Campaign a nationwide crusade. He traveled by train 18,000 miles and gave more than 600 speeches. He really brought it out to the people, and because of that, he was very, very convincing. McKinley ran what was called then a front porch campaign. He had lots of money and support and essentially was all over mass media. Bryan's chances were dashed at the last weeks of the election because, one, there was a rise in wheat prices, and two, employers were telling their workers that factories would be closed if Bryan was elected. So obviously nobody wanted to go out and vote for him at that point. McKinley essentially wins the election. He was lucky that he took office at the time that he did because the economy began to or seemed to revive. At that time, farm prices rose, factory production also increased, and the stock market increased, which is a huge, positive. Gold was found in Alaska, and essentially the Dingley tariff was passed in 1867, which increased the tariff to more than 46%. By 1900, we made gold the official standard of U.S. currency. So looking at the significance of the election of 1896, it marked the end of the political stalemate and stagnation that had characterized the politics of the Gilded Age. And by defeating Bryan and the populists, the Free Silver movement, essentially, Republican year of domination in both houses of the presidency. I should say era. By defeating Bryan and the populists, and the Free Silver movement essentially equaled a Republican era of domination in both houses and the presidency. We see the change of the Republican Party at this time, which was once the party of free soil, free labor, and free men. Now, however, it was the party of business and industry, and this is pretty much where it stays going forward. They continue to advocate for a strong national government. The Populist Party, unfortunately, begins to decline after this election, 1896, and essentially ceases to be a national party. The election was a clear victory for big business, urban centers, conservative economics, and the moderate middle class values. Beginning of modern politics. This is the age of the beginning of modern politics. McKinley was viewed as the first modern president. A lot of cool stuff happening here. Join us tomorrow in class and we'll talk more about it. See ya, History Geeks!